Good afternoon and welcome to the Stanford Historical Society program, Written in Stone, Stanford and its Plaques. I'm Julia Hartung, class of 1982, and a longtime member of the Stanford Historical Society Program Committee, which plans and organizes the wonderful programs that you see throughout the year. I'm very excited about today's program. You are in for a treat. Let me open with a question that may sound presumptuous in other settings, but I would venture to say that everyone in this room will understand why I'm asking and have an answer. When did you first fall in love with history? And what was the spark that ignited that interest? For Henry Segal, class of 26, his answer to that question is the reason for our program today. You see, when Henry arrived at Stanford 4 years ago, he didn't know he was going to end up majoring in history, and he didn't even know that he loved history. He was simply given the sage and fun advice by someone to always read the plaques. Thankfully for us, Henry took that advice to heart, and Stanford became not only his university, but also a place of living history. And it was through the stories he learned about through the plaques across campus that he not only fell in love with Stanford's history, but the study of history in general. Henry took that passion in many directions during his 4 years at Stanford, to his major, where he concentrated on United States, to his fraternity, where he became the historian for Sigma Nu, and finally, his fan club is here. And finally, to the benefit of all of us involved with the Historical Society, to the board, and as you saw, he's rolling off, but we had the pleasure of having him serve on the board for the last 2 years. Henry, as you've already heard, he's sort of the star of today, will be attending NYU School of Law in the fall, and he's originally from Houston, Texas, and his parents are very sorry not to be able to come today to be here in person. Many of you will remember Henry from last year's annual meeting when he served on a panel with Dan Edelstein around their documentary, Leland, A Stanford Story, which he co-directed. Today, we are going to hear about his favorite plaques and hopefully be inspired to pay a little closer attention as we walk this beautiful campus and care for its history. Let's give a warm welcome to Henry Segal.
All right, that was very kind. Is this loud enough? Okay, great. Standing closer. All right, thank you all for having me. We don't do the 50th every year, but I'm glad to be doing it this year. So you've heard I'm going to be talking about plaques, and I'm going to explain that is kind of the core, I think, of how I see Stanford. Before there was Stanford, there was a plaque. Before any mausoleum, church, or sandstone arch was constructed, a brass plaque was laid down on the cornerstone. You can see here, May 14th, 1887. That's just to the right of the church. Just as the university began with this marker, my foray into Stanford history began not with a class, but with plaques. As a freshman, I was sent a 99% Invisible article. That's a podcast, but they do a lot of stuff online. And it was called Always Read the Plaque. The premise is pretty clear. It's a few words, but it's basically that there are stories embedded everywhere in our environment. But it's not really just about reading the actual plaques. It's kind of a call to just look at things more closely. Don't think of the world as just a setting, but also a text, and really kind of catching more than a glimpse of the stuff that you walk by while you may be checking your email or chatting with friends. So today, my talk will neither be about the history of Stanford plaques nor an argument about how the university should handle them. I'll be sharing a set of stories that I've encountered over my time at Stanford, stories that are more than what is simply written in stone. Now, whether situated as a result of a donation or a tragedy, plaques make a claim on who gets to be remembered and why. One example of this is the White Plaza Memorial Fountain. You may see this in the brochure. There will be people fountain hopping with beach balls. But this is really a memorial to John and William White. These were twins in the class of 1949 who both just a year after their graduation died in separate accidents, one in a plane crash, one in a surfing accident. And this was a memorial from their father, Raymond. There's also, these are scattered around. There's the Harold Hatch McAllister Memorial Fountain. This was a junior who was going to graduate in 1926, who went to Pacifica, a place many Stanford students still go. Was with friends, got caught by the undertow, couldn't find his body for a week. His mother used the rest of the money that they were going to pay for his education to make this fountain. And she asked everyone, how about saying hello at least once a day? We're not all talking about memorials today. I promise I'll keep it a little bit light. But I'm just kind of giving everyone a tasting menu here. So many of these, such as the plaque under the El Palo Alto tree, serve as great fun facts about the area. If nothing else, the knowledge I gained from these, I think, just made me more confident as a tour guide. But there's kind of a lot of other things these are doing. Sometimes all a plaque is you'll be walking into a section and go, huh, all right, that happened here. But that being said, there were a lot on campus over the last 4 years that were not just a huh or that's interesting, but really kind of threw me under a portal, and I'm going to focus on a handful of those today. So I'm just going to start in Memorial Court. This is kind of the epicenter of the official plaques, at least. You're being reminded of the students, the alumni, and the faculty who died serving their country. It's not kind of the scene you get at Stanford every day, but it is a reminder of mortality, as we talked about last year at the university, that only exists because of the death of a child. And it kind of really, it shows an interesting portrait. I mean, most of these people did not fight for the U.S., at least the professor and the student, but there was a time when war was very prevalent here. Now, there's one in Memorial Court that is really, I think, not like the others. One, it's definitely not a memorial, but it really, I think, kind of brought out an interest of mine. And I don't know if anyone knows what this is, but this is just to the right of the opening into the quad. This is the commemoration of the motion picture research. And I've always been into film. I remember always kind of vaguely knowing of the horse in motion. Many people have seen that, whether it's on a GIF or a cartoon. People know it. But it wasn't until my frosh fall when I was actually holding a camera from the 60s right next to this now like seafoam greened, stained piece of bronze that I really kind of gave it the attention that it was due. And this felt like a very old camera at the time, but compared to what we're talking about here, it was really a spaceship. And I'm not sure if it was gratitude or a sense of obligation that I did it, but I really thought about why I was standing there holding a movie camera in my hand. So just some context on this. I think this is kind of a really fun one. I like to think of if you think of what the Oscars are, it's the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences. I think this story gets all of those words. So Leland Stanford, he was a horseman. He was into horses, also a collector. You may know this. And his skepticism of the equine anatomy actually came through looking at art. There's a story about a bet, may have happened, may have not. I don't know if it's that important. But it really came through looking at paintings. And in the 19th century, almost all of the paintings with horses running, they had the front two fully forward and the back two fully back, like a flying squirrel, um, when it was galloping. And this is kind of what initiated it. Stanford Senior was just very skeptical. This was the foreword of the study that he published. I, for a long time, entertained the opinion that the accepted theory of the relative positions of the feet of horses in rapid motion was erroneous. I also believe that the camera could be utilized to demonstrate that fact, and by instantaneous pictures, show the actual position of the limbs at each instant of the stride. This was pretty much his main contribution to the study, in the text at least. So it's unclear whether he made the bet, but he was sure willing to go to great lengths to prove himself right and follow his curiosity. That resulted in hiring Edward Muybridge to run this experiment. He was actually quite a complicated man. I found it this week, just 2 years before. He had killed his wife's lover about a year before, and I think it was pretty objective that he did that and got off innocent. So do with that what you will. So what did Muybridge do? In 1878 is when this study really started, and this was at where the Red Barn is. This is the racehorse Sally Gardner. They were able to do 12 exposures, and this is not how you would think of a camera going today, where it's 12 photos from the same camera. This is 12 cameras in a line. And this worked. You know, it was really only viewable through Muybridge's other invention, the Zoroscope. But the next year, in 1879, is when they really kind of got it, and this was with the 24 camera exposure, and they're a lot closer than I thought. And how they would do it is you can't really see them, but you can imagine there were tripwires at every camera going, so all the horses had to run through once, and that's where we got that. So the university carries the Stanford's name, but they are not at the center of campus. I think it's pretty unique. They were at one point, but now if you want to go visit the Stanfords or their stuff, you either have to go to the one-room triple at the Mausoleum or go to the Cantor Art Center, which has the permanent Stanford family collection. And if you go there, there's a portrait that is pretty much permanently up, and this is from Ernest Meissonier. And he was one of the more popular French painters in the 19th century, and someone introduced Leland Stanford to him, and Meissonier would not take him as a client. He didn't care how much money he had, and then Leland Stanford kind of just told him that he was the horse guy, and Meissonier had the same problem. He didn't really know how to paint the horses, and he really admired. I thought it was this really interesting relationship. He really admired Leland Stanford as an artist. He said, "We're collaborators now. I want to do your portrait." And if you look closely, he made sure the reel of film was under his elbow, which I think is quite interesting because there's not really anything else he's trying to show that's super specific. So I think that was probably one of his greater accomplishments at the time. Now, the plaques did not come in until 50 years after the first experiment. You may notice this is a different place than the first photo, or where you may have seen it or read it on campus. There's actually two identical ones. So there's the one in Memorial Court, and this is at the barn. I only kind of found sex. I recognized the golf course fence. But I thought this was really remarkable because I don't know if you can recognize anyone in the photo. There were some old movie references, but this is an old Hollywood day. So there was a psychology professor, Miles Walter, and he was very gung-ho on doing this, and he invited Louis B. Mayer, who's the man just to the right of the plaque, who is the M of MGM, the third M. And he was pretty much the biggest man in Hollywood at the time, and this was an industry that basically didn't exist before. And when these were unveiled, it was an all-school holiday, more or less. It was called Movie Day. It was May 8th, 1929. Every single person got out of class. I think it was a Wednesday. Every single person got out of class at 11 a.m. And there were three speakers. It was Louis B. Mayer. And keep in mind, this is about 2 years after the first talkie. For my younger friends, that's when the audio is synchronized. But this is like a very early Hollywood thing, and they could not imagine like what was going on. Louis B. Mayer, in the middle of Memorial Court, gave a speech on how the whole motion picture industry owes a debt to this experiment. It was really something. They also had William DeMille, who was the head of the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts, and Sciences. And this was an all-school day. Everyone got out of class at 11. And I think the most interesting part today of that day was actually not from Mayer or DeMille, but actually from Ray Wilbur, who was the president at the time. Now, this was in 1929. So he wasn't on campus. He was serving as the Secretary of the Interior under Hoover. But this was, I think of this as like Stanford's first Zoom. There was a banquet for movie night and movie day in Branner Hall that night. And I don't think anyone had seen synchronized sound in that room outside of a theater. And Mayer was able to bring in the equipment to play a pre-recorded speech of Wilbur in DC, and that was the thing that people seem to remember the most. And this was 50 years after. Now, 20 years after that, we're not even in the 60s yet, 20th Century Fox crew was setting up in Memorial Court for a scene in the war film In Love and War. One of the characters is a soldier who goes to Stanford, and there's about 3 minutes of it on campus. And a reporter for the Daily was walking in the court as someone snapped this photo of the crew, and he noticed that the camera operators were looking straight down the lens at the plaque as they were setting up for a shot, and no one was even noticing it. They were totally unaware. It was a bronze plaque that had worn out through the years. And I just thought it was interesting, like 50 years after this, we are having a day, and now it's like, oh, here's the Hollywood on campus. Take it for granted. So that one really called to me. I just thought there was a lot in it. But there are other plaques that are in, also kind of prominent places in campus that I think are also a little overlooked. This is on the corner of Campus Drive and Galvez, outside of the Arriaga Alumni Center. This tree is not here today, actually, but it was a few years ago. It's a quite nondescript tree, and it's not because I don't have the eye for that. It is because this is actually the most abundant tree on the campus. This is the Coast Live Oak. It is probably the most native tree to Stanford. Now, what is so special about this tree? I came across this, and I read this like The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. This tells the story of Gordon F. Hampton, a freshman who had only been here for 6 weeks, and there used to be a bonfire before the big game, and they would have the freshmen kind of be on watch the whole week before. So this was a Monday night, and they had these big whistles, and if they heard something, they had to blow the whistle, and all the freshmen would come roaring out of Encina Hall. Blood would be shed, but you did not want to blow the false alarm, the boy who cried wolf. And Gordon Hampton was sitting under this tree, and he wasn't really sure. He heard something, blew it anyway, and it was not a false call. And still 5 people, someone broke their nose, eye was bleeding, but it is written as if he is the most courageous man. I think this treats him more like a war hero than many of the plaques in Memorial Court, honestly. And I love the last line in parentheses, successfully defending the bonfire and saving the day, night. Now, why, what do we get from this? So this was Monday night. Happened again. So you could say this was just like he just blew it, but I think, the next night the guys fended off another siege. It didn't seem like it was normal for freshmen to be blowing the whistle like this. They'd probably rather have the bonfire burn than risk their social reputation. But I think this says something about Gordon Hampton. He was a nervous and bold freshman and had the courage so that it could be done on Tuesday night. And this was dedicated only 20-something years ago. Now, who was Gordon Hampton? Because this man did not die young. We only have a young photo of him. He was a very powerful attorney in L.A., and it was only a few years before Gordon Hampton's death that the bonfire stopped. It went until 92. And I thought this plaque was really interesting because it's really about the stories kind of that you tell rather than some other accomplishment. This didn't remember him as a father of 3 Stanford students, not as the high-profile lawyer, art collector, or philanthropist, but as the 19-year-old kid who blew a whistle once because, some kids across the bay were trying to screw with them. The memory of Gordon Hampton was not related to any professional accolades or family attributes. It was the story he told about himself at 19 that I'm sure his great-grandchildren know of, who are probably my age now. Now, if you look at the plaque, which you should always read, it's not to Gordon Hampton. It's to the tree. The tree is named after him. In 2020, something very sad happened. The tree was removed because the trunk was decaying. It had to be done. So the Gordon Hampton oak is no longer with us, but there is now a plaque to remember the tree that's not here. It's a plaque for the plaque. This is not a cropped photo. This is one frame. So there was a new one planted in 2022, and I was on the phone with Cyrus about an hour ago, which got overhydrated? Overwatered. Anyways, I thought this was really interesting. It was the plaque on a plaque, and it's named after him, but it's really they're both for the tree, which I kind of love. It's a very, very Stanford element with the most Stanford tree. All right, so there are hundreds. I'll keep moving. There are hundreds of other plaques on campus, maybe thousands. But that also means that there's probably thousands that the university chose not to go with. In 1940, a young JFK who had just graduated Harvard spent 3 months on campus. He was not enrolled as a student, but he was living on Mayfield Avenue in a cottage at 624, which is right. If you're looking at what was House Mitt, it's just to the left of that, kind of in the back. And he was just kind of hanging around. He was auditing political science and classes in the GSB until he left around Christmas to enlist in the Navy. This is a photo from that. And here's a letter from someone who worked for his family telling the landlord or that Mr. Jack will be checking out in December. 43 years later, a law student named David Lempert, this is in the 80s, fiercely advocated for a plaque. There was a U.S. president that lived on campus, and this should be, this should be marked. And he was a little bit upset. He thought the university was kind of becoming Hoover-Reagan University and leaving behind the Democrats. But he thought this was a very, very important thing. Now, the other President Kennedy, that's Don Kennedy, the Stanford president at the time, very clearly said no. That's him in the photo. And he said, if Stanford commemorated everyone who merely passed through, we would be no better than every town in the Mid-Atlantic with a sign reading, George Washington slept here. And most of his team agreed. Don Carlson, who's the head of relations, said, the view I share with others is that it was not a very significant event in John Kennedy's life, which may be true. But I think this is what they were afraid the school is going to become if every famous person who's been here gets a plaque. It looks like a Richardsonian Romanesque obituary section. All right. Talking about important things in people's life. The last one I'm going to talk about, I think, is probably the most significant plaque to my time at Stanford. And this I first heard of, but my journey kind of lasted longer than that. In the fall of 2023, with our resident tree historian Cyrus Patel, who's in the audience, and we were walking around Main Quad, talking about trees, and he mentioned like a very hearsay, rumored story. He wasn't even sure like who he heard it from. It was that there was a plaque somewhere near the math corner. It may be a prank. It may not be. It may just not be recorded. Who knows? There was something kind of up. And I went to go look at this, where he said it might be. And this is just south of Sloan Hall, the math corner. There's a raised planter. It's about 10 by 15 feet with one silk tree growing out of it. Flat dirt base, no grass. And there's a brass slab in here that's about the size of a briefcase. And I came up to this, and this is what it says. It's the Wright K. Sexton Memorial Park. Now, I don't want a memorial park named after me to look like that. There's no grass. So there's a few things off. But Wright K. Sexton Memorial Park, Ornanda enim est dignitas domo, June 1977. Okay, so there's Latin, so it seems like a little more serious. But this was really very different than any other memorial by a long shot. The Latin, I did a quick Google, obviously. Not a lot of results for Wright K. Sexton, but I was going to give that another day. The Latin translated roughly to something close to, for dignity must be adorned by the house, which was kind of hard for me to put together. There's not a house. There's not a ton of dignity in this little park. And it was anything but adorned. But who am I to judge for those who wish to honor Mr. Sexton? This may be someone's loved one, and I wouldn't like to talk about that. There was nothing on Google. I couldn't, for all my work, Wright K. Sexton did not exist. I had suspicions, but that wasn't enough for me yet to declare this a fake. Some people are very much off the internet, especially if it was a long time ago. Now, the Stanford University archives, which probably most people in this room have been to, they brag they have over 6 miles of physical material, 50 terabytes digitally. There is not a mention of Wright and Sexton in any of those files. I thought maybe it was the Wi-Fi, maybe I'm doing the Booleans wrong with the quotes. So I walked in with my own 2 feet into one of the archivist's office, and no one had heard anything about this. Nothing. Even I gave context. Now, it was at this point where I really swallowed my pride, and this is where I crossed the Rubicon of research, alia acta est, and I ventured all the way to the second page of Google. Now, this worked. It was quite shocking. There was one hit for Wright K. Sexton on page 2 of Google, and it was a Flickr photo from 2012. Had 260 views. Here it is. So not only is it the words, it is the plaque. It was posted by a guy named Thane Plambeck. He was a Stanford PhD in the 80s. The year is a little off, but this made sense to me. Now, he was my first lead in my search for Stanford's D.B. Cooper. And I thought this had to be the guy. Who else would be posting a picture of a maybe real memorial park? So I sent him an email, found his website, and I wanted him to make sure that he knew I was on side. So I don't want to say, are you Wright Case? I would write always the emails like, oh, I heard this fun story. Do you know anything about this? I said, anyway, when I Googled it, your name was the only one that came up. If you were behind this, would love to hear the story. So then I got nothing for about a week. I remember I was driving into town and country. I was at a red light. 6 days later, I got a reply. Here's what it read. Hi, Henry. I'm Gloria Gatlin, Thane's wife. He is not Wright K. Sexton, nor is he the installer of the plaque. The story you heard is correct, but Thane no longer remembers the details. Now, after Gloria was explaining that, it may have been, this is in this email, that it may have been a math or CS grad student, she added one more thing before signing off. It was very ominous. There is more to the story other than who installed it, namely why they did, but I have no clue about that. Sorry. Anyway, I hope there remains some mystery around it so that the powers at the university let it remain. Gloria. So Gloria and I met on campus the next week, and she explained everything she knew about this was from her husband, Thane. And in the late 80s, they met at Stanford. Gloria was a co-term. Thane was getting his PhD in computer science. And she knew, as if it were some sort of common knowledge, that the plaque was not official. Thane had taken her to see that while it was at Stanford. But she also seemed to have this kind of intuitive knowledge that it was a grad student, but couldn't really remember any of the other details. Now, one of the names, Gloria gave me a slew of names of potential grad students that her husband Thane knew from either the math or CS department. And one of them stuck out way more than the other ones to me. It was Harlan Sexton. Now, she thought this would have been too obvious of a candidate, but I didn't think that. I had a working theory that Wright K. Sexton was probably not an entirely fake name, but maybe 2 or 3 real ones. Once I saw Sexton, I just kind of put that together. So I had the Harlan Sexton on my corkboard. There was only one from Stanford, but I could not get a hold of him. This entailed committing to a LinkedIn premium subscription. I sent an email to one of his colleagues from over 15 years ago who thought that was weird. I actually got out an envelope and I was about to write a handwritten letter to where I think his house may have been in the Texas Hill Country. Did not send that. So in the meantime, I've been waiting for a week for a response, and I'm going to think about, okay, what else can I work with? How about Wright? Not as specific, but I figured it was a safe bet that if Harlan Sexton was a math PhD in the second half of the 70s, Mr. Wright may have been as well. But I didn't even know if I could trust the year at this point. Like nothing was true. So back to the wonderful university archives I went to save the day. And what the approach I took was getting all of the math dissertations within a plus 15, minus 15 year span of 77. There weren't that many. And you can also, I narrowed it down with a little old trick called Command F. But there was I think there was 2 or 3 Wrights. So I still didn't really know which one. I messaged who I thought a plausible candidate would be, and that night it was 8:20 p.m. I was walking around Lake Log on the phone with my mother when I got the notification. Hi, Henry. I know the complete story of the Wright K. Sexton Memorial Park. Thank you. I remember which direction I was walking, too. Harlan Sexton and I created it. It's a longer story than I want to commit to email at the moment. I'd be happy to tell you about Zoom or something similar sometime. Chris. So within a day, I got another voicemail from Harlan Sexton, who I hadn't heard back from yet, that it essentially said, a bunch of people are reaching out to me saying, some kid named Henry's trying to reach you. So, but that next week, I was speaking with both Christopher Wright and Harlan Sexton, both now in their 70s, ready to finally publicly share their story for the first time. But this story starts before my sophomore year, obviously. Many years before that, Christopher Wright arrived at Stanford in 1974. He arrived as a math PhD candidate without a bachelor's degree. He was going to Brown, where they have the very open curriculum, and was only taking math classes, and just decided to go kind of straight to the finish line. And Harlan Sexton arrived later that year. To be a math PhD, you have to take these qualifying exams, and they were studying over the summer together. They became friends very quickly. Now, we're thinking about 1975 Stanford. There is not the same EVGR, graduate housing accommodations. There was not a super generous stipend, Harlan told me. And within the first year, Harlan's roommate in Palo Alto had invited his girlfriend to move in. And the situation was just not working for Harlan Sexton. And, he was a grad student with an office in Main Quad. So he decided to move into his office on the third floor of the math building as a full-time resident. Now, we caught up last week, and I asked him, do you remember the room? He remembered the exact room. It was 383P. I went to go see it. It was also my first time in the math building, and it was just as he described it. It was a windowless room in the middle of the third floor, linoleum floors. Today, it is a computer room for graduate students, guarded by a 6-digit code that I had to swear an oath that I would not take a photo in there. So you're going to have to take my word for it. But Harlan was telling me what this was like. He had a mini fridge, a hot plate. He was describing his filing cabinets, where he kept his papers on the top, and the bottom were socks and underwear. Well, a desk, of course, to do the work. All of this and no bed. Harlan would sleep on his rug, and he was a regular exerciser, so he would just shower at the gym. And he even had a complaint saying he can never sleep in hotel mattresses because they are way too soft. So he was living there. He was having a good time. It was not long after that, in 1976, when Christopher Wright moved in to his office on the first floor. So now you may think, does the math department care about this? It was a bit of a blind eye. Their supervisors were okay with it because it was someone in the buildings all the time in 24 hours. There was also an issue a lot in this decade of fraternities going into the buildings at night stealing furniture. And they were talking about how, they would come in and they would be sent away by a 24-hour security team of Wright and Sexton who would just tell them to take a couch from the psychology department. So the department was pretty happy with it. There were people in there all the time. They kept good care of it, and it was easy for them to work. So it seemed like a great thing. And the blind eyes is the university was not insured for using these academic buildings as residences. So it was a bit of a don't ask, don't tell. Now, in June 1977, I promise I'm not going to go 1 year at a time until today. We've gone somewhere. In June 1977, Christopher Wright and Harlan Sexton were sitting on a bench right outside of that planter. The bench is not there today. It was a metal bench. They were sitting outside of their 60,000 square foot outer quad home. And Chris looked over and said, wouldn't it be nice if we had something to memorialize our time here? That, something that said, this is our home. Harlan apparently replied immediately. He said, that sounds great, but my name has to be on it. And they said, so the inspiration, they told a story of seeing this similar memorial park that was called the Harley J. Earl Memorial Park. And when I talked to them 2 years ago, they were both convinced that it was entirely fake. Not even the process of getting put there, but Harley J. Earl was not a real person. And Harlan described it as about 3 foot tall stone obelisk that didn't come necessarily to a point, but kind of did taper off, sitting on a grass median on Duania and Panama Streets. That's behind the church where the Daly building is. That medium does not exist anymore. There's been a lot of work there, but they described it as that cannot be a serious memorial for anyone. It is a tiny patch of grass that doesn't even have grass. And Harlan also described walking up to it and being able to lift it out of the ground. Like it was his understanding now when he said it was fake was that it was from somewhere else. This was not the intended location. But I think this is also just an interesting sign of the time because they told me this and I Googled it, and Harley J. Earl, this is also how they described it. I made a little rendering of a Polaroid. So this is what they imagine if you could just lift it up. This is a very pre-Google phenomenon, but Harley J. Earl was one of the most prolific car designers in the United States who graduated Stanford in 1908. And I have only heard of this Harley J. Earl Memorial Park. I think if anyone in this crowd wants to do a similar project, this is the one to figure out. There was a section in the 1976 Daily called Itch Me or Bug Me, and it was students who would just have general, things that were like, at the top of their head. And someone described it exactly how they did. They said, "What is this? Who is Harley J. Earl? What is his memorial? It's 10 feet long and 1 foot wide." And that was their idea. So that there's not really any other record of that. It's not really important right now, but it's important as that was their influence. Now, you may have noticed the plaque is not the Wright Sexton Memorial Park. It is the Wright K. Sexton Memorial Park. So I had accounted for Wright and Sexton, but what about the middle initial K? On calls, I would try and get an answer. I would refer to him as Mr. K, and Chris Wright would always interrupt me and say, "That's Dr. K for you." So I know that he's a doctor of some sort, but Mr. K also lived in offices at some time, and he had the same impulse to kind of leave something behind as a memorial, but he wanted to stay in academia after and didn't want anything that could risk a reputation or that his name would be visibly on a permanent prank. And to this day, I tried getting it out again last week. Christopher Wright and Harlan Sexton will not reveal the identity of Dr. K, Mr. Dr. K. Now, for the memorial they had discussed, Harlan wanted to translate. This is supposed to be a tribute to their home. And you have to do a little bit of Latin if you're going to be a serious plaque. And he wanted to translate "home is where the heart is." It's very sweet. But they went to a classics professor who was there over the summer. And this classics professor warned them that, heart was not the seat of meaning in the way the Romans would use it. It doesn't have the same, semantic meaning. It would be like saying home is where the liver is. And he said, there's a chance that there's going to be a plaque reading classicist who's going to know you guys are a fraud any day now. And Harlan and Chris were taking no chances on this. So I believe it was in that professor's office, they pulled a Cicero book off the shelf. It was De Officiis. And it was one of those ones that had the line-by-line translations. And within about 30 seconds, they landed on "Ornanda animas dignitas domo." And as they understood it, this meant a man's dignity is derived from his home, which they believed was funny because, in their words, they had neither dignity nor a home. It could fit on a plaque. It was funny. That was going to be it. So that's how we got there. Now, the manufacturing of this was quite complex. There was not a custom ink for plaques. Harlan told me that he found a chunk of brass in a scrap pile outside of the physics building. And then a few seconds later, he said, "At least I thought it was a scrap pile when I took it. I'm not sure that it was actually a scrap pile." I told him nobody's looking for it. But this was really not a weekend project. They took a class on campus to learn how to sandcast. This was not cheap. They got it professionally. They had the brass engraved. They even filled, if you look at it, I know everyone in this room is going to look at it in person at some point the next week, but it's completely flush. and they filled it in with typesetter's lead in the engraving. And it was because their original idea was to put it in the bricks next to the planter. And they explained that in the 70s, a lot of people would just walk around barefoot, and they didn't want people to cut their feet on the edges. So I think that's a fun little kind of sign of the times there. Anyways, when it was done, Chris even had the final piece finished professionally, smoothed and everything. Now, the installation did not take place until the summer of 1981, but you may notice, Henry, the plaque is dated June 1977. Well, that was the month that the idea was conceived, but it was also a bit of a strategic play to have an enduring monument that hopefully no one would see. Because if the grounds crew were walking by the next day and they saw something with the current year in it, they'd be, who put that there? But if I was walking by today and saw something that said 2021, I would be embarrassed to even admit that I've never seen it. So you would have to kind of just tell yourself, I guess I've never noticed it. So they predated it 4 years. Really smart. Now, another thing they did was to make it look really old. So by the time it went in the ground, it looked years old. And that's probably Dr. K's biggest contribution. He kept it. He had an apartment in Berkeley. He would keep it there outdoors in the summer in the rain. And he would take it. He would go visit his parents in Pasadena and bring it with him. I think it's crazy that I know where his parents live and only know his initial. And by the time the park was installed, it looked like it had been there for years. This kind of slight patina, it's actually gotten cleaner over the years, is not, it looked something closer like that at the start. Now, how did he do this? I mean, this was a time before cameras, but you still, I mean, to put one of these things in the ground, it's not just a command strip. Harlan actually did this in the middle of the day. This was not a ski mask operation. He did it in the middle of the day, a few weeks after he finished his PhD. And he had spent his last few years of the PhD doing kind of handy jobs around the math building because it would be like doing work on your house. So he had this great relationship of with the like building managers of, you know, changing light bulbs and the elevator. And they did not seem to mind. I think he told something, he was doing it in the garden. They knew what was going on. So with the sun shining, Harlan dug a hole 3 feet deep in this. He sank brass bars through these eye bolts. So these kind of round things he screwed into the bottom of the brass box, stuck the poles through them that would go into the dirt on the other side. Then with a trash can, mixed concrete, just like on a Sunday, poured it all in, screwed it in, and Christopher Wright was not there for the installation, but he did give me a good comment on it. He said, I mean, it can be removed. It will just take some effort. So it's pretty in there. Now, I told them, don't worry. The OCS statute of limitations, this is true, is only 6 months. And for the really serious stuff, it's 2 years. And that's after the discovery. And they had been actually discovered once before, but they did not let him publish it. And I have tried a little bit to track this guy down, but in 2006, a German tourist was on campus. Maybe it's unclear if he was working there for the summer or just stopping by, somehow found out about this story and wrote a blog post totally in German about like the smallest park in the world. And this was in 2006. Harlan was doing work with a company that had a university affiliation, and they kind of didn't want it out. And they said, in exchange for talking to you, we'll tell you the whole real story if you take it down. But they still have the HTML of that, so I'll show you what that looks like. It's quite fun. I don't know if there are any German speakers in here, but this was the only other piece of media, I think, on this. And it looked like there were more trees before. This is Christopher Wright, probably 20-some years ago. They have largely kept their park and the story to themselves. That was the whole purpose of it. They did it in a place that they didn't. It's low. It's supposed to be the same shade of brass as the other surrounding plaques. And seemingly the only sources of this have been from those in the math department. And they actually told me the name of a patient zero who kind of saw it and then told everyone. But even when I asked Cyrus, who told me, it was Brian White, who's in the math department. So it seems like this was just kind of a like, not some people in the math department knew, but apparently it was used as a cautionary tale of, because what happens when you leave academia, you are dead to them. That is what they would say from the first floor, because neither Harlan nor Sexton stayed in academia. So they would come back and hear these stories. But it really, I asked him, I said, how many people do you think know about this? And he said less than 200. I would be telling everyone if I did this. Now, I think it's pretty interesting. Chris and Harlan, they tried to build an invisible monument. You don't see that a lot. Maybe they are existing more, but they're really good. But there was always someone they kind of cared to share these stories with, even if they didn't know it at the time. And when Harlan was still living in the area, he would take his young kids to his park so he could learn how to walk. Very cool. And this would be a yearly thing, and the whole family would go. And I think it was until they were too old to hang out with their dad. And Christopher Wright too. He told me that he generally claims to be disinterested in plaques. But about 20 years ago, his daughter started as a freshman here, and he came during move-in, and he said he was like shockingly moved to see his park was still here. I don't know if he had been back. And this is a big part of his daughter's life. He showed with me some photos of when she was a freshman, the Model UN team from her high school would come to visit, and she would give them the tour, and she would take them all to her dad's park. That's another one of Chris. There's a bunch of Model UN kids who know about this. There's still kind of a part of the story we have to go back to, and that's Gloria Gatlin. This is the woman who gave us kind of our first lead on this story. And when I asked her to kind of just think about the prank as a whole, is it a prank? Is it like, if no one is supposed to say like, who are you pranking? And she said, there's just something so Thane about it, and that he shared it with the kids, and it stuck in their memories. Like, they thought it was cool, and they've probably told their friends, like, check out what my dad told me. And Gloria was explaining how her two sons know about this story too. Even if not in the full details, it was something that they shared with their father. Now, there was one piece of this whole thing that was like not expected for a project like this. And when I first wrote to Gloria in January of 2024, she told me Thane was not able to speak with me, but she didn't say why, and I didn't really feel like asking or prying. It was only later that after I'd sent her an early cut of the podcast I had been doing from the interviews about this, that she told me that Thane could not talk to me because he has Alzheimer's. And they're in their late 50s. And Thane is currently, and was then, living he had just moved into a memory care facility. And Gloria did not want that hidden. It came up in our interview, and she said, keep it in. This is not something we shouldn't talk about. So diseases like Alzheimer's and the reasons people end up in memory care are not things we should refuse to talk about. And she told me that when she played him the episode he made, something inside of him lit up. He laughed out loud when he saw his own photo placed next to D.B. Cooper. And at the very end, when he heard the episode was dedicated to him, he smiled. Now, 50 years ago, kind of going back to why we're here today, it's the 50th annual members meeting. We had a founder of this society. I never got the chance to meet him, but Professor James T. Watkins IV. I'm sure many of you knew him and were probably at that meeting. And he wrote something in an interview about why he started this society. And I've kind of haven't been able to stop thinking about that. And it was, Reading a good history of something you love is like listening to music. It is something worthy in its own right. And for James Watkins and the Stanford Historical Society, the story of Stanford is a story worth telling in the most vivid and varied way that they can. And that was what the writer said after Watkins' interview. Now, today, I have not tried to give you an academic account of anything. It's been anything but. But I have tried to share stories that I believe are worthy in their own right for being shared. It's probably not a lesson, but I believe these are the songs we sing of Stanford. That's James Watkins. This is the article it's from. And I really like. He seems like a very shy guy, but I really liked that way of sharing these stories in the most vivid and varied way we can. And I think that was kind of the through line I got for the three plaques I went at length about today. That's the galloping horse. I mean, this was shared through Movie Day, the portrait. It is really a big part of this university. This is Gordon Hampton. Who knows if he was actually sitting under the tree, but it is just shit. These are the stories that he is remembered by 100 years later. And it's Wright K. Sexton. And it's also Thane, who could no longer tell the story himself, but who smiled when he heard it. Because a story worth telling does not require that everyone who carries it remembers all of it. It only requires that someone keeps telling it. Thank you. Questions?
We have time for questions for Henry.
I was thinking of starting with questions. It would have been more interesting. Yes.
And I'm probably the only person who knows Brian White and knew James C. Watkins. Amazing moment. I wanted to go back to the gay liberation statue because it's close by.
It's right behind there. Sorry.
To me, that's really striking because it's one of the few pieces of outdoor art which is at Stanford, which is really provocative, and it makes a political argument. And Peter Thiel, in his first book about Stanford, complained about the statue that they were caressing each other. And I was in a big public debate with him in Treseder, and I said, Peter, let's go down and see what caressing is, because I don't think they're caressing each other. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on when it was installed, the statue was installed, it was vandalized by a bunch of Stanford students, one of whom I had some role in admitting, and I'm embarrassed to say. Any thoughts about, the history of that?
Yeah, I think it was in the early 80s. It was George Segal. He does a lot. He does a lot of these kind of look like this. There's a handful of these in New York. I think there's almost an identical one in Washington Square Park. I remember seeing kind of like an inscription scratched off, or it was faded so hard, and maybe it was vandalized or something, and then the pressure washing got it, or it was that. I actually went by the other day because I couldn't find out where the actual writing part was, but I remember kind of seeing it at one point. I don't know if anyone in the crowd knows.
I also knew James T. Watkins IV, and I recall very vividly that the first lecture he gave every spring began with these words: Stanford in the spring is the very vestibule of heaven.
Are Wright and Sexton still in touch?
I don't think they had spoken. So when I've actually never spoken to them together. I don't know if that was unclear. But they're friendly. They're not like I don't think talking to each other all the time. I remember one of them thanked me for like reconnecting them last time. They had like a nice phone call about it, but Sexton lives in the Texas Hill Country, and Wright lives in San Diego. And I don't know where Dr. K is.
Just one final word, and then we will all have some refreshments. The Stanford Historical Society is a membership society, and our work is done by all volunteers except for our 2 wonderful staff people. Being a member means that you get every month Sandstone and Tile, which is a wonderful magazine. You'll see some copies out there, just terrific magazines. You get email notifications of all our programs and so forth. If you want to join us, we have information outside. We'd like to talk to you about it. And so now, let's all go out, all our members and our guests, and have some fellowship and refreshments. Thank you.